Well, welcome. I'm Keith St. Clair. I teach in political science in the social science department here at Grand Rapids Community College. We're lucky to have here today Reza Aslan, who's written a new book, Zealot. And welcome, Reza.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I found your book fascinating. I enjoyed it's about Jesus the man.
Right, yeah, the historical Jesus, yeah.
Kind of from the Roman point of view, I guess, and why he was crucified and why he was a threat to the state, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. And the idea, especially about some of the personalities that we've heard about, for those who grew up in the church or went to Sunday school, Caiaphas and the relationship between him and Pontius Pilate, yes.
Right.
And I was
These were real people. They lived in a real time. We forget that, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, in your book, I think does a great job of kind of presenting the personalities and how these two men were actually friends, correct?
Well, maybe friends is a bit much, but they were very good partners. They worked very well together. They actually, their combined rule as high priest for Caiaphas and governor of Jerusalem for Pilate was the longest combined rule between any high priest and any Roman governor in the history of the Roman occupation of Jerusalem. So obviously they were doing something well.
And a very successful partnership in that
Successful insofar as they were both committed to maintaining stability in Judea at a time of enormous political tumult. I mean, you know, the first century Palestine, the time of Jesus, was perhaps the most tumultuous political era in the history of the Holy Land, which obviously is saying a lot if you know anything about the history of the Holy Land. And so, this was an era of widespread insurrections, of messianic uprisings, of these sort of peasant revolts, insurrections. I mean, there was this real sense among the Jews that they were living in an apocalyptic era. And so you had one after another these charismatic figures arising, leading revolutions against the Roman Empire, against the priestly aristocracy. And, for the brief time in which Caiaphas and Pilate were sort of in power together at the same time, they managed to fairly successfully keep a lid on a lot of these movements, including Jesus's.
Yeah, and you said that Jesus was unique as far as kind of the miracle workers at the time, in that he didn't charge for his services where the other ones kind
of
did.
He was unique not insofar as he was the one doing miracles. Lots of people were walking around doing miracles in Jesus' time. In fact, the traveling exorcist / miracle worker, because they mean the same thing. And I mean, we sort of separate miracle worker or healer from exorcist, but remember that in Jesus' time, illness was a sign of demon possession. And demon possession was a kind of illness. So they were one and the same. The sort of traveling healer / exorcist was a fairly common and very well-paid profession. Jesus was certainly not the only person walking around casting out demons, but he was the only person doing it for free. And that is enormously significant because it indicates the message that was behind Jesus' miraculous actions.
So it was kind of do you think it was maybe a good marketing technique to do it for free?
Well, I think that Jesus' entire ministry was predicated upon the notion of the reversal of the social order, that the rich and the poor, the powerful and the powerless, the first and the last will be switching places in the kingdom of God that Jesus envisioned. And of course, remember, he lived in an era of enormous income inequality, where a very small number of wealthy, Hellenistic, secularized Jews had amassed incredible wealth because they had married themselves to the Roman occupation on the backs of pretty much everybody else that had been lowered because of taxation and of tithing and of the tribute that you had to pay to Rome, had really become a kind of peasant class. And none more poor, really, than Jesus and his family. He came from a part of the Galilee, Nazareth, which was extremely impoverished, that had been absolutely left behind by the new economy that had been created because of the Roman occupation. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that the people that Jesus preached to, the people that he taught, the people that he healed, the people that gathered around him were people just like him, the poor and the dispossessed.
You said in the book that he didn't just heal the people, he cleansed them, which was an affront to the temple in Jerusalem, correct?
Yeah, that becomes a real sort of accompanying message to Jesus' healing actions. That, if you are a leper in, Judea in the first century, there is a way to get cleansed. It's just an enormously costly way. You have to bring a certain number of sacrificial animals and pay a certain fee to the high priest, go through an incredibly laborious process in order to be cleansed of the sin that resulted in your illness. What's really fascinating about Jesus and the way that he exhibits these healing qualities is that he's doing it quite openly as a challenge to the priestly authorities. I mentioned one very famous case in which after he heals a leper, he says to the leper, "Go and show yourself to the high priest and do what the law of Moses commands of you." Well, what the law of Moses commands of a leper in order to be cleansed is a week-long process that would cost hundreds, if not thousands of dollars by our, economic standards. But the thing is that this man is already cleansed. He's already been healed, and for free. And so the fact that Jesus says, okay, you've been cleansed, now go show yourself to the temple priest, is a deliberate poke in the eye of the temple priest. Look what I did for free. What you charge so much money for, I did for free. That's the message that's being delivered to the authorities. And as you can imagine, is a message that was quite threatening to the powers that be.
So the healing and the cleansing were kind of one and the same?
Yes, remember that illness and sin, illness and possession are one and the same. You are sick, not because there is something physically wrong with you. You are sick, whatever that sickness is, because there's something spiritually wrong with you.
So this man goes to the temple, and he wasn't meant to go there and actually perform the ritual. He was meant to show the priest that, look who did this, and he did it for free.
Right, to show up and perform the rituals that are required. I say in the book that this is Jesus' version of a joke. He's joking. It's a joke. Go and do these things that the law of Moses requires for your cleansing, which you don't need to do because you've already been cleansed.
But you say Jesus supported the rituals, but he didn't think that the temple should be charging for it? Was that the criticism?
I think Jesus, like the vast majority of Jews at his time, believed that the temple itself was holy. It was, after all, the physical dwelling place of the Spirit of God. It was the place from which God's Spirit emanated and spread to the rest of the world. Jesus absolutely believed that, as all Jews believe that. But like the vast majority of Jews, particularly poor, pious Jews like Jesus, their problem was not with the temple. It was with the priesthood. This priesthood that had grown enormously wealthy, that had essentially defiled itself by accommodating the Roman occupation. I mean, the priesthood in the writings of the time was seen as just an abomination, that their presence on the temple, which was, after all, holy land, not just defiled the temple, it defiled the entire land. Josephus, the great Jewish historian, refers to the priesthood, all of it, as a, quote, band of avaricious lovers of luxury. And that's pretty much how most Jews thought of the priesthood.
So this corrupt priesthood collaborating with the Roman occupiers, Jesus is opposed to. And you say that Jesus was not just somebody who was a pacifist, or he wasn't a pacifist, but he wasn't just there speaking about we should just all get along. He was a revolutionary from your point of view.
That's right. He was
correct?
a revolutionary, absolutely.
He wanted to challenge the temple authorities. He wanted to stop the tithing there and to initiated a rebellion against the Roman Empire.
Well, look, if a Jew, any Jew, and there were many of them, any Jew stands up in the first century and says he is the Messiah, he means something very specific. He means he is the descendant of King David, and he is here to reestablish David's kingdom on earth. Well, if you are claiming to be ushering in the kingdom of God, you are claiming to be ushering out the kingdom of Caesar. That is why every single man, without exception, who stood up and said, I am the Messiah, in the first century, was killed for it. Every one of them. Because that statement is a treasonable offense, including Jesus. So, just in the very notion of Jesus' self-presentation, his self-identity, that in and of itself would have been a seditious act in Rome. So, of course, Jesus was a revolutionary. The idea of the Messiah is a revolutionary figure. But I do want to emphasize that there is a great sort of gradation between violent revolutionary and peaceful pacifist. I say in the book that there is no historical evidence that Jesus himself openly espoused violence, though he had a very, complex idea, a very complicated notion of the use of violence and force in reestablishing David's kingdom. I mean, he wasn't a fool. He didn't think that the greatest empire the world had ever known was going to be removed from the Holy Land as God commanded by asking them nicely, through some sort of sit-in. That's not how it works. But at the same time, he wasn't a pacifist. He understood, as he himself said, that the kingdom of God requires force. But he thought that the force would be God's force. Of course, as a good Jew, as a follower of the Hebrew scriptures, he understood what all Jews understood, which is that the great wars and victories of the Israelites, whether it was the cleansing of the land of Israel or the defeat of the Canaanites or the Amalekites or the Jebusites or, all of those great battles that the Israelites have won throughout their history, it was God who defeated the enemies. It's God who killed Pharaoh's army. It's God who killed the Amalekites. It's God who defeated the Canaanites. The Israelites often just sort of stand there and watch it take place as fireballs come from heaven. So the messianic revolutionaries of Jesus' time, they understood that they themselves couldn't defeat the greatest empire the world had ever known.
It would be a miraculous
It would be
revolution.
God who would defeat it. Yeah. Their job was to be zealous, to be devotional to God, to be loyal, and to sort of work as God's instruments. So I think sometimes when I say that Jesus wasn't a pacifist, people think that I mean Jesus was some crazy, terrorist or something. But he's neither of those things. He understood that force and violence have a role to play in the establishment of God's kingdom, but he thought God would take care of the violence.
And you mentioned a prominent part of your book is the passage in the Bible, a quote where it says, Jesus saying, "Do not think that I brought you peace, but
That I've come to bring peace, but the sword."
I
That's
brought
right.
the sword." What did he mean by that,
And
in
indeed,
your estimation?
And indeed, before he flees to Gethsemane to hide out from the authorities, he tells his disciples that they should arm themselves. He says, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and go buy one. Again, I think all of this is to emphasize that a man calling for the removal of Rome from the land that God set aside exclusively for his chosen people, a man calling for the establishment of a new kingdom, the kingdom of David, is a man who understands that that is a call to revolution.
A call to arms for revolution.
It is a call to arms for revolution, absolutely. But he's also, again, he's not a fool. He understood that he himself, that no Jew was going to defeat the Roman Empire, though he couldn't have known that 30 years after he died, that's precisely what the Jews would do, that they would actually rise up and manage to kick the Roman Empire out of the Holy Land. But he just assumed that God would do that.
Yeah, I mean, that was the other, from my point of view, very insightful is showing how the Jewish rebellion around 70 AD
Yeah, 66, yeah.
was so important in the development of Christianity, because
Right.
I think you were suggesting that after that rebellion, there was an effort of the writers of the Gospels to kind of play down the revolutionary aspect now that the Romans were now, many of them, converts to the new faith.
In 66, for the first time, this sort of Jewish insurrection that has been going on for almost 100 years actually works. The Jews revolt against Rome. They managed to cleanse the Holy Land of the Romans. They managed to keep the Romans at bay for 3 years, mostly because the Romans were dealing with their own internal issues. When the Romans return, they kill everybody. In 70, they burn Jerusalem to the ground. They destroy and defile the temple. They kill about 100,000 Jews. What Jews survive are scattered into the Roman Empire, many of them sold into slavery. And Judaism itself becomes no longer a legitimate religion in the Roman Empire. It's no longer a legal cult in the Roman Empire. Every single word of every gospel that we have was written after this event that I just described. And so they reflect this post-revolutionary, disastrous post-revolutionary mentality. That's right. They are written about events that took place before the revolution, but they're written after the revolution. And so that tension exists throughout between some of these very same revolutionary tendencies that Jesus portrays in his Gospels, in his teachings, and a deliberate attempt to downplay those tendencies as much as possible by spiritualizing them. So in other words, the kingdom that Jesus was talking about, it's not a real kingdom. It's a heavenly kingdom. It's a celestial kingdom. It's not a kingdom that's going to be established on earth. It's a kingdom that'll be established at the end of time. There's no political ramification to it, in other words. And this attempt is something that scholars can really see in the Gospels. It's very clear when you sort of break it down to its constituent elements and see it in its original language. You can see how certain aspects of Jesus' teachings were tempered to reflect a post-70 reality.
Even before that rebellion, it's fascinating in your book how you talk about the tensions between the leadership after Jesus' death between Paul and Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, and the tensions between them, and how Paul's kind of brought to task as he's brought back to Jerusalem because he had been preaching about not obeying the Jewish rituals.
Follow the law anymore. That's right, Paul says. Yeah.
But it's after the death of all of them that Paul's writings end up taking preeminence, and we get modern Christianity with the break from Judaism, right?
I think that in our sort of popular imagination, Jesus founds Christianity. He starts a new religion. He dies, and then his followers all sort of in a unified way spread that religion that Jesus started to the rest of the world. That's the imaginary version of it. The reality is that Jesus is a Jew preaching Judaism. He dies. His followers begin to interpret his actions and his words, but they interpret them in about a dozen different ways. There are all kinds of Christianities in the first century of this movement. But the two major branches are the ones that you said very, very clearly. The branch led by James, Jesus' brother, in Jerusalem, which is a very Jewish ideal. We are Jews preaching Judaism. We just happen to believe that the Messiah has come. And then there's the more universal branch preached by Paul in the diaspora, outside of the Holy Land, which its fundamental feature is what you just said, which is that not only is this not Judaism, it's kind of anti-Judaism. Like, you don't have to follow the law of Moses anymore. And while today, obviously, Paul's version of Christianity won, I mean, it is the largest global religion in the world. It's certainly not Jewish religion anymore. What's fascinating is that in the lifetime of both men, it was James's version that was ascendant, and Paul was kind of a fringe character, He was one of these marginalized outcasts. The difference between James and Paul, however, is that James, like Jesus and his brothers and all of the disciples, was an illiterate peasant. Paul was a very well-educated, sophisticated, urban, cosmopolitan, Greek-speaking Jew. And Paul wrote his ideas down, and James did not. And so after 70, when Jerusalem is destroyed, along with James's church, the original church, all that exists anymore of what we call Christianity is Paul's writings. And so that becomes the foundation for what then becomes Christianity. And James is kind of written out of history altogether. If you grabbed 100 Christians on the street and asked them about James, the brother of Jesus, they would say, Jesus had a brother? Jesus had 4 brothers. And one of them, James, was in charge of the Jesus movement for 30 years after Jesus' death. Let me say that one more time. Jesus was in charge of the Jesus movement for 3 years. James was in charge of it for 30.
Now, you mentioned in your book that that what you're setting out to do is rather, in some ways, speculative, and you attempt to draw on a variety of sources, both historical and biblical. Mm-hmm. And I think you seem to use the Bible, or at least the Gospels, and what I liked about your approach is you seem to take them at face value or at their word, except where you could argue that they were implausible.
Right.
Like
right.
Jesus being born
Yes.
in Bethlehem as opposed to Nazareth, for example.
Yeah, I think some scholars, because the Gospels are not historical documents, they are theological arguments. In other words, they are not eyewitness accounts of what Jesus said and did. They are theological reflections of who Jesus was. For that reason, a lot of historians just throw them out completely. They say, well, it's useless, and you can't get any kind of historical value out of a document that is not a history, it's just, theology. But I think the majority of scholars would agree with me in saying that, no, there is a way to use the Gospels and to kind of tease out historical kernels out of them, to figure out what is more likely historically accurate and what is less likely historically accurate. And indeed, the methodology for doing so has been in place for 200 years. I'm not the first person to do this by any means. And while, there are disagreements about exactly which verse is more likely historical and which is less likely historical, there's very little disagreement about the methodology itself. And the methodology itself is somewhat complicated. For instance, there's the theory of multiple attestations. If something shows up in all 4 Gospels, it's more likely to be historically accurate than if it just shows up in one, although it depends which one. If it just shows up in Mark, we're more likely to take it seriously, because Mark was the first Gospel written sometime around 70, than if it, say, shows up just in John, and then we can just ignore it, because John was written somewhere between 100 and 120 AD. But to put it in its simplest, academic way, basically all we do is we take the claims of the Gospels, we analyze them according to what we know about the history of the time in which Jesus lived, and we know a lot about it. And if it fits, we take it seriously. If it doesn't, we reject it. So that it's kind of a simple process in that regard. Does it match what we know about the world in which Jesus lived? If it does, then I take it seriously. I say, well, then let's take it at face value. If it doesn't, then we just, it's simply not historical, and we ignore it.
You've gotten some more than your fair share of criticism,
Sure.
which I suppose is okay for book sales, but nevertheless, when people say that Christians who are devout Christians might feel offended by your portraying Jesus in a more human and historical context as opposed to what they believe, Jesus being God himself.
Right.
And your background has been a point of criticism for those same critics as well. The fact that
I was a Muslim, then I became a Christian, then I went back to Islam. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what is your response to them as far as Are they saying that because you're a Muslim that you've got an agenda to basically make Christians lose their faith by reading your book?
I guess some people would say that. I mean, it's funny because I have received hundreds of emails from Christians, and not a single one of them said, your book made me lose my faith. Not a single one of them. In fact, the majority of them have said the opposite. The majority of them have said that the book has actually empowered their faith. See, the foundation of Christianity is that Jesus is both fully God and fully man. The problem with that belief, however, is that it's hard to keep the God part from subsuming the man part. You know, when you go to church, rarely do you hear about the man Jesus. You mostly hear about the God Jesus. And even when you hear about the man Jesus, everything that you hear about is with this sort of understanding that this man is also God. And I think the reason that the book has been wildly adopted by Christians, I mean, I hear from them all the time, there are currently, according to my publisher, something like 150 church book groups that are reading this book, you know, in their churches, is because whether you agree with, you know, my conclusions or not, this is an opportunity to really understand the consequences of that foundational belief that Jesus was, whatever else he was, also a man. Because if he was also a man, he lived in a specific time and place. If he was also a man, his teachings were addressed to a specific audience. His teachings were about a specific set of social ills. His actions were in confrontation to specific political and religious leaders. So if you really want to know who Jesus was as a man, you need to know the world in which he lived, because whatever else he was a product of that world. And so this widespread impression that there has been this sort of massive Christian backlash to this book is just not true. It wouldn't have been such a massive bestseller in the US if it weren't for Christians buying it. Now, it's true that, you know, if you are the kind of Christian who cannot even bear to consider Jesus as having a context, right? If your view of Jesus is purely as God, and so therefore who cares where he lived and who he lived with and, you know, the situation of the world in which he lived. His words are universal. His actions are eternal. How dare you try to place them in context? Then yeah, you're going to be offended by this book. But I am a person who takes faith, all faiths, very seriously. Whether I'm writing about the historical Muhammad or the historical Moses or the historical Jesus, I always write about these things with an enormous amount of respect for these people. I'm writing about these people because I care about them. I really want to know about them. I admire them. And I hope that that comes across, you know, when I write about them.
This exercise that in writing this book, others have gone before you,
yes,
and doing much the same.
Yes.
What makes your approach different, or how does your approach to this question about Jesus the man different than what other writers have done?
It's not. I mean, I think this is the thing. A lot of people always ask, you know, what new ground have you broken in your book about the historical Jesus? None. There is no new ground. As I say, this has been a 200-year-old quest, and frankly, there's nothing more to say about the historical, barring some great archaeological discovery, which is possible. That's it. Whatever is to be said about the historical Jesus has been said already. And so I'm not trying to break new ground. What I'm trying to do is invite a different audience to the discussion. You see, these texts on the historical Jesus are often academic, scholarly texts, and they're written for an academic, scholarly audience. What my book is, and what I've tried to do with all of my books, is to take these very heady, scholarly topics, the origins of Islam, the historical Jesus, you know, and to make them accessible, appealing, to write about them in such a way as to invite others into a conversation that I and my colleagues have been having for 2 centuries. And I think that that's what makes this book successful. It's not anything that it says, because frankly, really, anything that this book says has already been said by scholars and colleagues before me. It's that it's said for a different audience. It's said for an audience that normally wouldn't read a book about the historical Jesus. It's an attempt to get other people involved in this conversation. And that's, I think, what I'm most proud of, is that it's worked. That, like it or hate it, at the very least, people are talking about the historical Jesus in a way that they weren't before.
Well, again, the book is Zealot. Reza Aslan, thank you so much for talking to us about it. It was fascinating.
Thanks for having me.